Hey, welcome to the Sixers Talk podcast. So glad you could join us for your listening pleasure. Danny Pommells and Noah Levick. A special guest here on the podcast is John Gonzalez from Sports Illustrated, a senior writer with that magazine. And he's got a great new initiative he's working on that he wants to tell you about. So without further ado, we'll dive into our interview with John Gonzalez as we get into trade deadline stuff. Ben Simmons, Doc Rivers, the whole kit and caboodle. Have a listen. We'll join you afterwards. Gonzo, what is up? Thank you for joining us. Glad to have you here. A lot to talk about. How you doing, first of all? The hair is well coiffed and looking good as usual.
It is so good to see both of your smiling faces. I know it's a podcast, but this is wonderful. It's like being home again.
I know, and you are in LA, so let everybody know John did adjust his schedule, I'm sure, to wake up a little bit earlier than normal because I'm sure he has some late nights trying to keep up with all this NBA trade deadline stuff because it just seems to be constantly evolving and revolving around you. But John, come on, man, let's get into it. I think we're at a point where it's like, I mean, Noah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like, who do you believe at this point? Like, who's reporting is most impactful to you? You have, maybe the Adrian Wojnarowski 50-50 vibes of whether Ben Simmons and James Harden trade will happen. You have Bill Simmons saying that Seth Curry is the major key in the cog. The Nets want Curry and Simmons in any package deal. Maybe Tyrese Maxey is one of the players that should be included depending on who you believe. Like, who do you believe and what do you believe right now here? We're kind of at the 11th hour, closing in on the Thursday deadline.
I believe that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Here we are coming up on another trade deadline. And oh, by the way, the Sixers are in the thick of everything per usual. I feel like I'm just really glad that I'm not covering the Sixers full time anymore because that would drive me insane. But it's exciting. I mean, it's good to hear that there's finally some wheels moving on this Simmons situation because it felt like for a while that they were going to end up being stuck with him through the trade deadline. And maybe that will still end up being the case. But I'm hopeful that Daryl Morey is out there, talking to people and that maybe by Thursday, Simmons is on the move.
Yeah, where have you stood on Morey's stance of it's not the worst thing in the world necessarily to wait through the deadline if a better deal is available down the line, and that could theoretically be what's doing right by Joel Embiid?
Yeah, so I'm of two minds here, Noah. Like on the one hand, every trade that's been mentioned, every single one, I've been like, yep, you should do that. Like the Pacers are interested before Brogdon had signed his contract, and maybe they could get Brogdon and LeVert. I'm like, yep, I'm in. The Kings are interested, and maybe it's De'Aaron Fox or Halliburton and Harrison Barnes, but yep, I'm in. Oh, the Hawks, they could send him to the Hawks. I think he'd have a great time in Atlanta. I'm in. Like all of these are yeses for me because right now you're getting exactly zero from Ben Simmons. So to your point about like you don't want to waste a year of Joel Embiid, I'm on board with that, right? Like any warm bodies that would help, that would be talented, makes sense in terms of improving your team. However, the other part of my brain goes, I trust Daryl Morey. And if Daryl Morey goes, this isn't enough return, I'm going to wait, then look, he's smarter than me. He's been one of the NBA's best general managers since 2006. And if it comes and goes and he hasn't moved Ben Simmons, then I trust that there's a plan.
Yeah, you bring up Morey, and he was on the Mike Missinelli show and specifically addressed, as we talked about on the podcast. That's fine, but Morey was of the ilk that, hey, I understand so many people are saying, you don't want to waste the season that Joel Embiid is having, but at the same time, we will be doing Joel Embiid's future a disservice if we didn't get the right value for Simmons when we do make this trade. So with that said, you bring up Caris LeVert, a team, surprisingly, the Cleveland Cavaliers are right in the thick of this race to be the top team in the Eastern Conference. They pick up Caris LeVert in a trade and bolster their, wing production, defense, what have you. The pressure has to be on the Sixers to do something, though. They can't just sit on their hands here at the deadline, right?
I mean, I don't think anybody who's a Sixers fan wants them to sit on their hands. And there is pressure. But there's also an expectation that when they finally do move Ben Simmons, they're going to be moving him for the right piece or pieces. So just to do something, I think would be like long-term detrimental, not just to the team, but to Joel Embiid's career, right? I mean, like you don't want to waste Embiid's prime. There's no doubt about that, but you also don't want to move this massive piece in Ben Simmons for something that would yield diminishing returns. So it's a complicating factor for sure. And that's why, like, I think everybody's a little on edge here, right? I mean, you want to move Ben Simmons. I would love for it to happen by Thursday, but I also don't want it to be a situation where like a year from now we go, ah, man, if only we had waited till something better came along.
So I guess a related question with all of this, obviously we're watching the Sixers every night and the Philadelphia market and aware that the standings are tight. And then it's been a bizarre crapshoot of a season, frankly, with the impact of COVID and all these injuries. Sixers aren't that far back from the top spot in the East, but they also don't really look like a championship contender if you're just going by the old eye test. What's your take on how far the current version of this roster is from actually having a legit shot at a title?
I mean, the East is so wide open. Like, I know, like the Heat, as we record this, the Heat are atop the Eastern Conference, and they've had a ton of injuries, and Jimmy Butler's been in and out of the lineup, and Kyle Lowry's been in and out of the lineup, and the Bulls have had injuries, and the Bucks have looked, like an approximation of the Bucks. And Danny, you mentioned the Cleveland Cavaliers going out and getting Karis LeVert. Like, all those teams are in the mix, right? And then you've got the Nets, who I thought were going to be the runaway favorites. Harden's not coming back for a little while. Or I'm sorry, Durant isn't coming back for a little while. And, they had the Kyrie Irving situation, and now Harden has been a little banged up. And on top of that, they've lost 8 in a row. So to answer your question, I think, like, do they look like a championship contender? What does a championship contender look like in the Eastern Conference? I think it looks like everybody I just outlined. It could be any of them. So, I mean, I think the Sixers, even as currently constituted, if they don't make a move, would it shock you if they won the Eastern Conference? It wouldn't shock me if any of those teams won.
It might not shock you, but at the same time, you mentioned, like, you could say that, and I just saw something today that said Kyrie Irving is only eligible to play in 10 of the 29 remaining games that the Nets have left because of the New York mandate on vaccines for him to be able to play in home games. So you kind of, like, the East has kind of swung on Kyrie's decision not to get vaccinated, because you would think the Nets would be, like, far and away the favorite to win the Eastern Conference. But the pressure, I think, really kind of just grows for the Sixers to do something to maximize this window of it being wide open. So, you could stand pat. You could hope for everybody to get healthy and kind of come along. But a one player could be the difference between you being in the Eastern Conference Finals or getting bounced in the first round. If you could get another all-star caliber player to play with Joel, who fits the system, and kind of the team gets healthy around them, like, suddenly you are the best team in the Eastern Conference going away. Yeah,
I mean, look, I'm all for, I want to really underscore my main point here. I am all for moving Ben Simmons. Like, let's do it. But also in the Harden situation, right? Like, it's not just Ben Simmons that you're going to have to move. Now you're talking about extra pieces. And the extra pieces part is where I start to wonder about whether or not it's worth it, because if he's going to be available in the offseason, you're going to have to move off a bunch of people to free up the cap space, right? I mean,
to be able to sign them,
Yeah, and ESPN pointed this out in the Woj and Ramona piece, where they had an anonymous general manager say, well, why would the Nets give up, like, or do any deal that is anything less than what they'd have to get in the offseason, because the Sixers would have to clear all this room. Makes complete sense. But if we're talking about, like, some combination of, Seth Curry and Thibault and Ben Simmons, I'm okay with that. If we're talking about Maxey, now I'm less okay with that, because Maxey has been, like, such a revelation, and he's young and he's cheap. And it's like, man, you've got this, like, you found this gem that you didn't even really understand that you had. And I'm not sure that I'm willing to move off of Maxey just to get the deal done and end up with, like, a super expensive James Harden, like, midway into his 30s. Like, that's maybe where I draw the line.
Yeah, with Harden, obviously it's a short-term gamble, and I think on paper the later years of him in Philadelphia could be kind of ugly and injury-filled. Is that, I guess, how you see it? And do you think he boosts, like, the short-term title odds to a significant degree, or not so much because he's not that MVP player anymore?
Well, no, I mean, I think he's absolutely incredible. And I think if you add James Harden, I absolutely believe that it boosts their title chances right now. I mean, even though he's not having like a typical James Harden season by his outrageous standards, if you look at his numbers, they're silly. I mean, like he's still one of the best offensive players in the league. Now, defensively, you end up like losing a little something if you're going to move out Thibault or, Danny Green or somebody like that. But I'd still make that move. To your point about like, what do I think that he would be in his mid-30s? I think his game is still like, I think it'll age okay in the same way that Chris Paul has aged pretty well, because it's not like Chris Paul is like hyper athletic, right? Neither is James Harden. His game isn't predicated on like, I'm going to get to the rim and just dunk on you. His is, I'm going to, change speeds. I'm an incredible passer. I know I can get you to foul me. I'm going to get to the line. And like, I'm just going to be like a nuisance on those step back threes. So I think, he'll be fine in his mid to late 30s, but you're still going to be stuck with like a massive, massive contract on a guy who will be declining in some way, shape, or form. But he's still so good. He's still so good. I would kill to have him on the Sixers. It would be amazing.
For sure. Yeah, I know we've talked some on the podcast about how his game might age well, and him and Embiid drawing millions of free throws a game.
Oh, I love it.
Probably a terror for 3-4 years down the line. Just for me, with the injuries and the age, Danny Green's season this year comes to mind, and he's 34, and one game it's the hamstring, and another game it's the calf, and then he hurts the hamstring again, and some of this stuff, it just seems like it's inevitably outside of a player's control, and you kind of have to bank on good luck with the injuries. And obviously, you go back to last postseason with the Nets, he re-injures the hamstring in game 1 against Milwaukee, and he's a shell of himself for the rest of that series. And that's a costly mistake if you're investing a lot of money in a player and something similar happens. So I guess it's a kind of risk that these guys are paid to assess, and it would be a big one on the Sixers end, but it's a great player that they're taking that kind of risk on if they do it.
Before he got to the Nets, though, he was pretty durable. I mean, like he was really good. But you mentioned something there, Noah, and like Danny, I think you know this about me because you and Marshall and I used to talk about this all the time. Can I tell you how excited I would be to watch them just shoot a ton of free throws? Like getting to the line and shooting free throws. Well, most people go, this is incredibly boring. It's an art form. It's underutilized. I love it. Like I might be the biggest free throw shooting fan of anybody I know. And just to see them at the line, just like wearing people down and everybody getting frustrated with it. Yes, please.
I'm one of the people who feels like Joel Embiid is not going to get half of these calls in the playoffs. So he needs to adjust in that matter. So I don't even know if especially with the way that they took out that little, verticality rule or whatever, when they pump fake and like get guys and lean into them, like that really affected Harden's game and his frequency of trips to the line. But I want to get your thoughts, John, on this. I think it's time, particularly I'm really interested to get your perspective because you were definitely, survived the years of the process with the Sixers and a great perspective on the team, and you have the national perspective. So I need to draw a line in the sand on exactly who has the leverage here. Now, the Sixers have a 25-year-old three-time All-Star. The players they're trying to acquire aren't that. Bradley Beal is older. Damian Lillard was on the other side of 30. So is James Harden. In my eyes, the Sixers have more leverage with Ben's upside than maybe some of these other teams want to, admit. Do you feel like the Sixers have leverage in trying to move Simmons outside of what happened against the Hawks, or do you feel like they're desperate and need to kind of include players in the deal in order to sweeten the pot for other teams to give them something they value in return?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's an interesting debate because it's a beauty in the eye of the beholder type of situation, right? Like who has the leverage? The answer is yes. Like if this was a conversation that Bontemps from ESPN was just having, where he was saying, I'd rather have the next 5 years of James Harden, or I'd rather have the next 5 years of Ben Simmons than the next 5 years of James Harden. Okay, maybe, but it also depends on like which team that is, right? Because, we've all seen what happens. Ben Simmons is a really, really good player. He can influence the game in so many ways. He's awesome on the break. He's a great rebounder. He's an otherworldly passer. He's a giant defender who can guard 1 through 5 and switch on everybody. All of those things to the good. To the bad, we all know the bad. And the bad happens in the playoffs when, the games are different. They're played differently when you're like putting people into the pick and roll mixer, and the defenses are different, and they're going to sag off of them, and they're going to force them to shoot, and they're going to dare them to get to the line. And that becomes problematic. So it really is about, which teams you're dealing with and what they see in Ben Simmons, and then, what you're willing to give. To the conversation that we were talking about, like the Nets. Would the Nets be willing to do a deal that's south of what they can get for James Harden in a sign and trade this offseason? That's their leverage. But the Sixers also have this really good young player who could impact a team. So that's why I think that this has been stalled. Because, you've got all these teams who go, no, I'm
right
in the driver's seat.
So let's say the Sixers disappoint. Sounds like you and many fans, and do not make the Simmons deal pre-deadline, but they try to shore up 1 or 2 of these holes that have been created by Simmons' absence, like the transition playmaking, forcing fewer turnovers. They're now one of the league's worst rebounding teams. Do any of those current weaknesses stand out to you as ones that are most important to fill?
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird team, right? Because I could see them making, like, let's say, no, to your point, that they don't miss, or they don't end up moving Ben Simmons, right? And then they go, okay, well, what's some smaller things that we could do to help Joel Embiid this season? The whole team right now, aside from Embiid and Maxey, really is like a bunch of small things. Like they've got a bunch of like pretty okay small players. And I don't know that getting some pretty okay small players who aren't already on the team like really changes anything. Like what would you guys do? Like people were talking about the buyout market, or maybe you could get like a Dorian
Kemba being on the
Finney-Smith.
buyout market. That was intriguing to me. Maybe if he doesn't get traded, maybe the Knicks buy him out and he's available.
Yeah, I mean,
they need a backup point guard or more ball handlers, I should say.
and I wonder about Kemba though, because is Kemba washed, or is that just the Tibbs effect? I don't know. Because Tibbs decide, like, he has the shortest rotation in NBA history. Like if he could play 4 guys, he would. But the NBA is like, no, man, you got to run 5 out there. And Tibbs is like, one day. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of Kemba, but and I also don't know what they do if it's not a massive move, because they, like I said, they already have all these like fine to better than fine role players.
For me, I think if one player is out there who's an athletic wing who can rebound, that would help. That would make the team a little bit better. As you said, it's not a difference maker, to use Maury's language. It's not a move that shifts the way the Eastern Conference looks, but it would help a bit. I do wonder what's going to happen here with Shake Milton if he ever gets healthy. He's had this back injury lingering for over a month.
Yeah.
Obviously, the team's ball handling situation is a lot worse when he's not available, and you've got Furkan Korkmaz pressed into that duty. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, it just seems unlikely to me that there's a move that just has a big impact out there that is not James Harden.
Fingers crossed. I don't know. I mean, like, look, 2 weeks ago, if you had said, like, where's Simmons going, I would be like, nowhere. He's going to be rattling around New Jersey in his giant house. Like, he's not going anywhere. But now, like, there's all this smoke and people are talking about Harden out of nowhere. And like, maybe like things are going terribly in Washington. Maybe Beal becomes available. I don't know. Although there was talk about maybe them trying to acquire Sabonis. So maybe they're not willing to give up just yet. But the Trailblazers too. I mean, Dame's sitting out there obviously he wouldn't help right now, but Dame's sitting out there. The season's been a complete and utter disaster. They just signed Norman Powell and then they ship him off to the Clippers. So maybe, and then there was a talk about them potentially moving CJ McCollum. So I don't know, maybe things are starting to shake loose.
There is always the sentiment that, which maybe LeBron James did in free agency a few years ago. I mean, this current trade talk has really come out of nowhere to really ramp up here before the Thursday deadline. But in the offseason, it might have been a different feel where maybe James and his camp were using the Sixers as really just to play off of them for the Nets to give him a better deal. Is there any of that out there that maybe this is just, Harden's camp trying to, pump up his worth or show that, his value and using the Sixers and leverage that way?
I mean, James Harden is a pretty well-known entity, right? Like, I don't know how much greater his value could be other than like, oh man, we could get James Harden. But also interestingly, he doesn't have an agent because he's one of these guys who could just like go. He has a manager. Apparently they've been looking together to try to find an agent for exactly these situations that you're discussing right now, Danny. But like at present, he's just one of those guys who knows he's going to go in and get a max deal. So why pay the agent his percentage? I'll just keep that in my pocket, which is genius. But in these situations where you've got James Harden telling everybody publicly, no, I'm committed to Brooklyn. I want to win here. But then privately, all these whispers about like complaints about his teammates and coaches in the front office, like that are getting around the league, at least enough that there's a little bit of smoke around the fire. Like, I don't know. Maybe he really does want out.
I've got a non-trade deadline question for you that I'm curious your perspective on. So you wrote an excellent piece for The Ringer about coaching in the NBA and how difficult it is to evaluate. This was at a time where everyone was heavily scrutinizing Brett Brown.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about Doc Rivers and the job that he's done on the Sixers?
I'm going to give you the same answer that I give on Brett Brown, which is I think that there's a handful of coaches and this was the whole premise of the piece that I wrote. Like, in addition to the fact that we have the NBA tracks everything about players, right? I mean, down to like how far they run, how fast they run during a game, like the way that their sleep patterns go, what they're eating, they track everything. With coaches, we don't have any information. Like, we're watching these guys and we're going, I don't like that. What happened there? It's probably the coach's fault. I mean, okay, like there's some information on like sideline out of bounds plays or after timeouts, but really we don't have much information. So I think at the top of the NBA, there's a handful of coaches, 3 to 5, who are better than everybody, right? You'd put like Kerr and Pop and maybe Spoelstra and 1 or 2 other guys in that conversation. I'm probably forgetting somebody obvious. And at the bottom, there's some guys you go, man, 3 to 5 guys I wouldn't want anything to do with. And then in the middle, everybody's just about the same. And you don't know how they're interacting with their guys, right? Like, you don't know what kind of manager they are. Like, I had a conversation with Steve Kerr one time where he said he wished that the coaches in the NBA were called managers, kind of like in soccer, because he thought that's like 90% of the job. It's not X's and O's. It's dealing with your guys. So I always thought Brett Brown was awesome with that. And I've been around Doc enough to suspect that he's pretty good at that. So I think he's fine. And from just a content perspective, and this is an important point that like pull back the curtain a little bit. Brett and Doc are amazing for content. Like, some guys are a real pain in the ass to talk to in the NBA. They're the opposite. Like, stick a microphone or, a recorder or, a camera in front of their face and they'll just go. So from my perspective, yes, please.
No, your piece was extremely persuasive to me. So no convincing needed there. I've just noticed recently with Doc Rivers, it just anecdotally feels like a lot of the dealings with the media and the image he presents has a big impact on how people see him, and more so than the actual in-game calls or what he's doing. And as you said, that stuff is so difficult to evaluate. Like, I know even for me, I try to keep track of, okay, he did a nice job managing the Green Thibault rotation here, or, this rotation decision paid off this game, did not pay off that game. He called this set a bunch in this game and it worked and didn't seem to make as much sense in this setting, whatever. But we're not head coaches. We haven't been in that position before. And you don't want to lean too much on like only people who've held that position can have an opinion. Like, of course we can notice when a coach, as you said, does a horrible job or does a great job, but I'm very much with you that outside of that, there's a large middle section, and Doc Rivers probably falls in that section. Yeah.
We're not privy to the information that they have too, right? Like, the just countless variables that go into any decision or how they're managing those rotations. There's so much data that they have that we don't have that informs their decision that we just are looking at from the outside. But when you're talking about his interactions with the press recently, I've always loved interacting with Doc. I think he's great. I thought, he was frustrated when he got asked that question where he said, would you ask Pop that? He knows that we would ask Pop that. He knows that any coach would get asked that. And like some people took umbrage with it, like, oh, he's not Pop. Look, he's had an amazing career as a head coach in the NBA. I think he just caught him on a bad day. Like sometimes you get frustrated, and not for nothing. Like as somebody who loves the Philadelphia media, we can be a huge pain in the ass. Like I got frustrated with us all the time, and I was one of us.
In such a results-oriented business, though, John, does Doc have something to prove after, blowing the 3-1 lead with the Clippers against the Nuggets, after not being able to get past the second round with the 76ers? Does he have something to prove in order to pay off the fact that he's one of the, 10 coaches in NBA history with over 1,000 wins, the fact that he has won a championship but hasn't had much success in the playoffs? Do you feel like there's kind of like, what have you done for me lately type of thing?
I'll give you a yes with a but, because he is, as you said, one of the most successful coaches in NBA history. And I'll give you here, Daryl Morey. I think if you asked anybody who's around the league who the top 3 to 5 general managers are, if you don't get Daryl Morey out of their mouth immediately, I'd be shocked, right? And he's never won a championship. He's consistently one of the best general managers in the NBA, and he's never won a title. Why? Because it's really hard to win a title. Doc's always in the mix. Now, in the mix probably like doesn't get you as far with Philadelphia fans as you'd want it to go. And I'm certain that he would tell you that he was disappointed that they never got at least to the Western Conference Finals, let alone the NBA championship with those Clippers teams. Those were underachieving teams, but they also were in the mix, right? They had opportunities that just didn't work out. I had this conversation with JJ Redick when he was on the Clippers before he went to the Sixers. And we were talking how they couldn't break through. And he was like, that's always the narrative until we actually do break through, and we will. He was confident that they would, and they didn't. He was wrong. But like they had those pieces together and they thought that they could get through, and they, for whatever reason, any number of factors, they blow the 3-1 lead, as you mentioned, like these things happen. But I still think Doc can like look at his career and go, man, this is a really good career. I've had an incredible run. I hope it gets better, but so far so good for me.
I also look to, I think, obviously coaches have different strengths and weaknesses. And with Doc Rivers, I believe his first season, he wins Coach of the Year because he has an overachieving team that squeaks into the playoffs. Does the same, I believe, in 2017-18 with the Clippers. This year, I think the Sixers have performed better than many expected. If we were told they got zero games out of Ben Simmons. So it seems like in those situations where you need a rallying presence, but not obviously a guy who's been there before and is not going to have players rolling their eyes with rah-rah stuff. Like Doc Rivers is a pretty good guy to have in charge of your team if you look at the big picture of his career.
Yeah, and not, I mean, that's a really good point. Like this team, if you had said to me, you get 0 Ben Simmons games, and you have the supporting cast that you have, and you're a game and a half out of the Eastern Conference first place, like pretty good. And specifically, look at the year Embiid is having. Embiid gets all the credit for that, right? That's him. But still under Doc's stewardship, I mean, the way that he uses Embiid and the way that Embiid has flourished works. It just does.
And Embiid even pointed out, he calls his number over and over and over again in a way that Brett Brown did not, because Brett Brown loved organic offense and he didn't love forcing it. And he also wasn't as big a fan as playing Embiid for 10, 11, 12 minutes when he had him rolling. So yeah, I give him credit for that. And then Tyrese Maxey's development as well, which, has been obviously a bright spot for the Sixers and taking a lot.
I give, what though, but that's really, that credit goes to Ben Simmons. So thank you, Ben Simmons, for
it's Sam Cassell. Give Sam some credit.
Just disappearing. Thank you.
It is the NBA MVP in South Philly, John?
I think so. I mean, look, I realize that there are people who will say that,
let's just put it, Nikola Jokic.
Yeah,
helped hand the Nets their 8th straight loss and a triple-double. I think he was 12 of 15 from the floor.
It's incredible.
Joel Embiid went for 40 in 28 minutes. So there.
I mean, look, Jokic has been really great. He's an incredible basketball player. And if he ends up winning the MVP award, yes, people in Philadelphia will get pissed off about it. Everybody else will go, that's okay. But I think the season that Joel has been having and the way that he has carried this team and kept them in the mix in the Eastern Conference, that for me elevates him above Joker. But it's 1-2. It's like those are the two candidates. And if it's Joker, he will have earned it. But I hope and believe that it's Joel, because really the NBA has been put on notice all season by Joel that like he can do anything he wants, whenever he wants, against anyone he wants. And that's been his entire season so far. And it's really elevated a team that, as we said, they've got some nice role players. They've got some, good average bit guys, but that's basically it beyond him and Maxey. And I think that's all credit to Joel. So I hope he wins it.
Joel wants that MVP, man. I would hate to see jilted at the altar twice Joel Embiid with a chip on his shoulder next season. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, I love that motivating stuff, but we've obviously seen him benefit from that and use that. But I think this is the year. I do, because after a while, like you're watching him do this game after game after game where he's just dominating everybody in every facet. And as I said, the free throws, that alone puts him over.
Start college, build skills, and complete your degree with Wilmington University. 100% online options and affordable tuition makes WilmU work for you. Learn more at wilmu.edu.
You've obviously seen his development from the early days, the process era and everything. He's big on narrative and trying to tell his own story. So you listen to him being snubbed from All-NBA. That bubble season was one factor in him rededicating himself to fitness and hiring a chef and all that. We talked a little about Doc Rivers' influence as well. Just how do you think he's become this great and this unstoppable, and how did he get to this point?
When we're talking about snubs, that goes back to the very beginning, right? When he didn't play enough to win Rookie of the Year. And it was Malcolm Brogdon, who I was like, oh man, that's the worst Rookie of the Year ever. I take it back. Malcolm Brogdon's a really good player. He just is not always healthy. But yeah, I think those factor into his development where he wants to show everybody, as Danny was saying, he's got this chip on his shoulder. I'm better than everybody. But man, like I remember even like a couple of seasons ago during the off season, like LA in the off season is where the NBA goes, right? Everybody in the league just comes out here. They're just living out here and they all play pickup games and they're all working on their game. And Markelle Fultz was out here and I had gone to the gym to watch Fultz, and he uses the same trainer as Joel. And it was a gym packed with like NBA superstars, right? It was like Jason Tatum was there and like a bunch of other people, and Joel was dominating them. And like, that was just even a couple years ago. And now a couple years later, to see how that progression has like manifested itself every night in the NBA is just remarkable. He really has taken his game to that level where there's like a couple of people in the NBA where you go, okay, no matter who's guarding them, no matter what team we're playing, it's going to be a bad night for them. And that's Joel now. It's really cool to see.
Random tangent. Remember, you had a great piece on Mo Bamba pre-draft, and you popped into my head when Mo Bamba was going off for like 8 threes and a career high against Embiid, who got 50 on that night. Hat tip to you for having Mo Bamba on my radar early as a guy to watch, and he had his best night against Embiid. So there you go.
Yeah, Mo's a really nice dude. He had a rough start in Orlando. Like it was just a bad fit. He had Vucevic ahead of him. Like he wasn't getting playing time. He was injured. And I think like a lot of people were really quick to label him a bust. But with playing time and opportunity and being healthy, like we're starting to see, a little potential there, which is really cool because again, he's a nice kid. He's really smart and he's eager to learn and play better. So it's nice to see him doing well.
John, what is your perception of the 76ers ownership group? Stephen A. Smith made the assertion that Josh Harris was maybe pulling strings behind the scenes on what the value was he wanted to see in return for Simmons. On the flip side of that, you have Michael Rubin, who is supposedly so close with James Harden that might influence him coming to Philly, and that is one of the reasons why he wants to be here. So you kind of can't have both of those things, I would assume, where, you have the relationship with Harden, with Rubin, who's pushing to get James here, but, Josh Harris is making the price so high that actually making the trade happen isn't actually coming to fruition. So what's your opinion of the ownership group? What do you hear about them? And do you think there was any truth to what Stephen A. was saying?
Yeah, mixed. I think Stephen A. is probably about right. I think Rubin tends to be more the relationship guy, but ultimately, like, the main partner is Josh Harris, right? It's going to be Josh Harris and David Blitzer, and they're going to make the massive calls. I'm sure Michael Rubin is, on a plane with Jay-Z and Meek Mill and whatever, like, he's got those connections. Awesome. But ultimately it comes down to the other two guys. And for the other two guys, I've always had sort of mixed feelings, right? Because look at what they've done throughout their tenure. I mean, like, they come in, they realize that they've got to shake it up and that they've got to change things. And they empower Sam Hinkie to do something that makes complete academic sense. And then they pull the rug out from under him because the league puts one hot light on them and they get complaints about the whole tanking and the process thing. And all of a sudden it's like the Colangelos parachute in and the whole thing explodes. And that was a mistake. And I think that they would tell you that it was a mistake. And then, they go and empower Elton and they realize Elton probably needs some help. And so they go out and get one of the best general managers in the league. So that's to their good. So it's been sort of an ebb and flow with this ownership group. I think sometimes they get in their own way and sometimes they second guess themselves when they shouldn't have to do that. I'm hoping here I'm hoping here that they figure out the right path.
They kind of struck out on the stadium deal where they were trying to help use that Penn's Landing area to, build a new arena. You think that that's at the forefront of their mind, like maximizing their dollar or pushing this team toward a championship?
Danny, they're billionaires. So I think we already know the answer to that. Billionaires, I don't know a lot of magnanimous billionaires, who are about like the public good. And look, if you've gotten that rich, it's not by accident. And I think that's why when you're talking about that stadium deal, when they were talking about potentially, public money going into that, no, thank you. And then also, how does it impact the community? I mean, this week, to do a little Sports Illustrated Weekly plug, we've got a story. The Super Bowl is coming to Los Angeles, right? SoFi Stadium is incredible. It's beautiful. It's one of the best stadiums I've ever been to in my life. It was also privately financed, all to the good, right? But it's in a neighborhood in Inglewood that is predominantly black and brown, over 90%. And it's like greatly impacted that community and not necessarily to the good. So but billionaires don't care about that. What they care about is, look at this shiny new showcase that I built. And isn't that cool? Because I don't live in that neighborhood. So you already know the answer to your question.
Center,
yeah, you already know. Yeah, Barclays Center is a perfect example.
Yeah,
I will say, and when I think of the Sixers ownership group and what the first instinct is, like, the reality is, soon after the season got suspended and the NBA was on pause, they tried to institute, salary reductions for some of their employees. And you had Joel Embiid coming out and saying he'd pay for the folks who were impacted by that. And then they reverse course and apologize. But it's worth
remembering. Their first instinct, though, right?
Exactly. It's worth remembering as how they operate. And again, doesn't mean like you can't run a sports franchise well and invest heavily in it and be motivated to succeed, because success often corresponds with making money. But yeah, they're about the bottom line, of course.
The bottom line comes first, always. They're rich for a reason. And then if they are successful, I'm quite certain they want the team to be good. I'm quite certain they want to succeed and win a championship. But all of those are ancillary benefits of being rich.
Well said.
Will we see a parade down Broad Street, John? Will there be a Sixers parade?
Man, that
at
would
some
be fun.
point here in the next 5 years?
I hope so. I hope so because Sixers fans are a unique group. Like everybody's an Eagles fan. There's a lot of people. Everybody is, right? Like whether you watch sports or not, if you live in Philadelphia, go Birds, right? You hit anybody with the go Birds and off you go. The other three, they're they have their specific specific fan bases, and really with the Sixers, it's such a tight knit community, especially for everybody who went through the process. Like I covered all those games, and there are a bunch of maniacs who watch them. I got paid to watch that. It was awful, but everybody else was watching it for fun and like really invested in it. Like the Rights to Ricky Sanchez guys, Mike Levin is one of my best friends. He's built a whole career around watching a team that makes him want to pull his hair out. And like 9 times out of 10, he's complaining about them and still he never misses a game. So I hope for everybody like Mike and like me, who has been through the entire process situation and watched this team and questioned ownership that, and for Joel, yes, you want very much. I hope that it happens.
Putting you on the spot, but is there a process memory covering those teams that's your favorite?
I mean, I couldn't be a bigger fan of Sam Hinkie. I mean, and Brett Brown, really. Like one of my here's a favorite memory. Back when we had the 700 level show, Tom Feiner, who is helping produce the show right now, and Aaron Chalaznik, who's since left the company, and I left the company. They found a bunch of photos from Brett Brown back in the day, like from his college career when he played for Patino, and like when he was playing in the short shorts at Boston U, and like just a bunch of photos, like really interesting photos of Brett throughout his career, like well before he ended up at the Sixers. So we went and sat in Brett's office, and we were doing story time with Brett Brown and showing him these pictures, and he was like reminiscing and all this stuff. And Hinkie came in and he joined us. And while he was joining us, he picked up a basketball and started like dribbling between his legs. And I was like, hold on. Like, are you kidding me? Like, I didn't know that you had any athleticism whatsoever, which led to a conversation about like, yes, he was actually a pretty good athlete back in the day. And like, there was those moments, like just having conversations with those two, top of my list.
But the team was a lot more accessible then, don't you think? What you could.
Isn't it ironic that that Hinkie used to get crushed for not talking to the media when that was never the case? He talked to us all the time. He just didn't do it on the record or on camera. I couldn't get him to do an on-camera interview, but I could call him up and we'd talk for an hour. And then I'd be like, I got to go do something. Like I have to hang up on you. But like, yeah, you're right. Like they were so accessible back then. And I really enjoyed that, especially Brett too. I mean, he was the guy that they put on camera and on the microphone to answer every question. And he was great about it.
I think as silver lining, just my perception, but it seems like the folks with the Sixers are realizing that they've got young marketable stars in Maxey, Thibault to a lesser extent, and obviously Joel Embiid. So perhaps we see a little more of their personality moving forward and get more access to those guys. But yeah, Daryl Morey, he does not give press conferences often. The last time we heard from him was NBA draft, I think. And
we'll give him credit though. He's always walking around the arena. Mm-hmm. He is always right among the people.
Not meant as a criticism. No, he's just work focused and just to your point, in comparison to Sam Hinkie, that's not the norm for NBA top executives to be speaking on the record all the time. So
he's similar to Sam in that way where you can talk to Daryl Morey. Daryl Morey talks to people all the time. You just might not see him on camera.
Hey, worth mentioning to anyone who is listening that Joel Embiid will be on the Mike Missinelli show at 4:00 today. And we will definitely be gleaning stuff from that. We have an NBA trade deadline special coming up at 3:00 on Thursday, where we'll have Mark Jackson and the full Monty of people answering your questions and whatnot. John, please take a moment and plug your stuff. And the way I interpret it is you're basically bringing the magazine to life with your podcast. Is that right?
Danny, you just did it for me. Thank you. You're a professional. I think you have a career. This could be your future.
I'll work on that.
Yeah, you're killing it per usual. So I'm at Sports Illustrated now. We have I'm a senior writer there, but we started a new podcast called Sports Illustrated Weekly. It's available wherever you get your podcast. Please subscribe and listen. Basically, like for those of us who are in sports journalism, or if you're interested in sports, you like a good story, Sports Illustrated has been doing that for a very long time in the pages of its magazine and on SI.com. So we're trying to take that sensibility, that magazine storytelling ideal, and make it a podcast, right? So if you're familiar with like HBO Real Sports, same concept. We're going to have multiple stories in every episode, and we'll deliver to you hopefully some really original reporting and entertaining storytelling. Last week's episode was a semi-Olympic preview where we had the story of Erin Jackson, who's a speed skater you're going to hear a lot about at the Winter Olympics. She went from roller derby to becoming one of the best speed skaters in the world and the first Black woman to win a World Cup event. Her story's awesome. We had Ben Rhodes from Pod Save America on to discuss the political boycott and the human rights abuses in China. And then we ended it with Michael Vick. Michael Vick came on to tell us about the first time he was in Sports Illustrated and what it was like back when he was at Virginia Tech, just like before he became a household name and he was just starting to blow up. And it was an awesome conversation. So
who's turned into a great analyst, Michael Vick.
That too. I mean, I love talking to Michael Vick. Like I know that he's a controversial figure for a lot of reasons. And I was skeptical of him when he landed at the Eagles. And since then I've interviewed him like as much as probably anybody's interviewed Vick. He's awesome to talk to. He'll never dodge a question. Like he's the kind of guy who you could talk to. You want to talk about the dogs, he'll talk about the dogs, but that's a story that has been told and retold. And we wanted to tell a story that hasn't really been told in quite some time. So he was great to talk to.
I remember one time at Eagles availability, and we, talked to Vic, and he, always talk after every practice, like you said, answer all the questions. And he was like, "That's it. All right, guys, I got to go back to the locker room and do 1,000 push-ups and 2,000 sit-ups. I'll see y'all later." I was like the whole room just started looking at each other like, okay.
I mean,
professional athlete
who doesn't get to where he is without, working. But
right.
But then on this week's episode, we've got the story, as I mentioned to you, SoFi Stadium. It's going to be home of the Super Bowl this week. Everybody's really excited about it. But we look at the economic impact and just like the impact to people's lives in Inglewood. And then we talk about Brian Flores and the NFL hiring practices. And then for those of you who are familiar with the Around the NFL podcast, it's one of the most popular football podcasts in the world. A guy named Chris Wessling, who's a good friend of mine, was on that podcast. He died of cancer last year at 46. So we remember Chris.
John, we appreciate your time, man. Excellent as always. And we'll be looking out for all of your work as we usually do. John Gonzalez, everyone, formerly of NBC Sports Philadelphia, and now with a Sports Illustrated as a senior writer. We appreciate your time, John.
Thanks for having me, guys. Great to see you.
Man, Noah, what a trip down memory lane. We got some, current stuff that we discussed. Just great talking with John per usual.
Yeah, just a little personal story for me. If I was asked to name my welcome to the NBA moment, it would probably be when I met John when he was down in Philly covering the Sixers playoff game. Obviously, as you could probably tell from that interview, I'm a fan of him and his work, and excellent perspective on the Sixers. And of course, he has a unique blend of the national zooming out a bit, but he knows Philly fans and what they're all about better than anyone. So just a real privilege to have him.
Yeah, and he definitely has a way with words, the written and spoken words. And it's easy to understand how he almost had a career in politics at one point of his life. So shout out to John. Always a pleasure having him. Definitely a friend of the podcast. And I know Sixers fans are feeling good about themselves right now. A stretch of games where the Sixers should have won against the Wizards. They should have won that first game on the road trip, but they beat the Bulls. Joel Embiid goes for 40, and they're back home now for 4 games. Most recently, upcoming here, they'll play Tuesday against the Suns before the deadline on Thursday. So what are you expecting from them against Phoenix, the top team in the West, Noah? This will be a real barometer for them. Hopefully they'll be healthier than they have been.
Right. I think the first question is, does the team have the same roster? So we shall see. There's about 30-ish hours before that game. So if no trades are made, the Suns are as tough as matchup as anyone in the NBA. They make you fight for every basket. Embiid versus DeAndre Ayton, tends to be an entertaining one. We'll see, what Chris Paul brings to the table. Phoenix is lethal in crunch time, so even if the Sixers are tight late, like Phoenix is going to be favored to win that game. So yeah, it's a great test for the Sixers if it's still the Sixers that we know, and I'm really excited to see what that game brings us.
And on the horizon, you have the Cleveland Cavaliers on Saturday. If this is the same Sixers team, like you said, and the Cavaliers picking up Karis LeVert, as we mentioned with John, so that'll be a definite test for this squad. Joel Embiid continues his onslaught. Noah, a quiet, casual 40 points against the Bulls, out-dueling a guy who seems to be great friends with Joel, and they have a really good rapport, DeMar DeRozan. I'm curious if you feel like Embiid is at a point now where, I know we talked about it on the podcast, but he kind of has to get some help in order for them to reach the heights that they're thinking about, even though, as John pointed out, that the East is wide open.
Right. I think the way Daryl Morey has framed it publicly makes sense, that it's all about championship probability. And the Sixers, as they are, have a shot, but it's not a great shot. And of course, you'd like to better the odds, especially given you've got an MVP favorite on your roster. I think the Nets and the Sixers situations at this point are obviously closely intertwined, and we're all riding on these, frankly, often conflicting reports about what's going on with James Harden and Ben Simmons. So we'll see how it all pans out, and we'll have a much better gauge on this stuff probably the next time we talk. But I think as is, that first instinct being, gosh, you want to give Joel Embiid a little more help. Of course, it's eminently logical at this point.
He is Noah Levick, the acute, sharp-witted mind that he is. Make sure to check out his work on NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com as we come up to this trade deadline and thereafter. Thursday, we will rejoin you with a live Sixers Talk podcast on all of our streaming networks and platforms at 3 o'clock at the deadline. We will go live. We will answer your questions. So please be sure to join us and give us some of your thoughts. Amy Fadul will join us, Mark Jackson, as well as the regulars that you have come to know and enjoy. So we will rejoin you then Thursday at 3 o'clock for Noah Levick, Ben Barry, and Tom Feiner, who you heard John talk about, always helping us out with getting our stuff on the web, online. We appreciate you listening to Sixers Talk podcast. We're brought to you by Wilmington University. Wilmu Works.